Thank you. Next slide. So beyond knowing who I am from the introduction that Brenda gave, this is me as a whole person, the integrated me, as we talk about in social work. You can see what the primary things that are inborn in me, because I love and honor my parents. This is the name that they gave to me that I totally embrace. My DNA shows that I am 44% Nigerian and 33% Cameroonian, and the Congo and the Western Bantu, which is suggestive to me that I am probably a direct descendant of slaves. And I am Black, I am female, and I'm cisgender. My secondary or my acquired ability, and this is who I am in the room. This is my presence, my emotional, intellectual, social, mental presence in the room. I am a single mom. I'm a sister. I'm a sister-in-law. I'm an aunt. I'm a grandmother. I'm a cousin, and I'm a sister friend. I am second generation college educated on my maternal side, and third generation college educated on my paternal side. I'm a practicing spiritual Christian. I was raised in Chicago on the South Side. I am a transport to LA 36 years ago. I have my BSW and my MSW. I'm a social work educator for the last 24 years. I am a certified parent educator. I'm a guide and a storyteller. I'm a classic movie buff. I'm a lover of vintage and retro clothing. I'm a lover of art by the artists Annie Lee and Ruth Russell Williams. And I'm the collective artifacts of historical African-American or Black mammies from the Civil War period. And in all my travels across the states and abroad, I have actually, in South America, I've actually been able to find mammies. So that says something about the enslavement and transportation, the movement of Black people. Next slide, please. I want to say I love social work. I love social work. I wanted to be a social worker ever since I was 14 or 15 years old. But engaging in this difficult conversation in the room, I don't want people to mistake that I don't love social work, that I'm an anti-social worker, or I'm an abolitionist, or anything of that such. I love social work. But there is something in social work that I think we need to learn about the history of social work and what social work continues to do to BIPOC people. Next slide. So in getting comfortable, I just pose this rhetorical question. How comfortable are you discussing cultural differences, power, and privilege? And that means race, class, gender, ableism, whatever it is, we have to get comfortable with that. Next slide, please. I'm going to stop there. And there was a question there that I just saw. It says, I'm not an abolitionist. Could somebody read that to me? Because I just want to respond to that.
In saying that you're not abolitionist, do you mean you don't believe in the abolition of social work, the police, prisons, or both?
I don't, let me say this. I don't believe in, I think when I think about abolitionists, what it means to me, how I define meaning to it is abolitionists were white people who had the best intentions. And sometimes hypocrisy was embedded in those best intentions. And so that's why I don't fully embrace being an abolitionist. but it doesn't mean I see what their work was and is. I totally understand the importance of police presence, but I don't necessarily define that kind of meaning to it all the time. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that we get to conscious intention today, because I think sometimes that we move around in the world with disconsciousness, and that's why we don't think about the complacency that's embedded, ingrained in social work practice. And so in order to see that and respond to it, then we have to have conscious intentions. And the first place is that where we need to go is to be able to develop the grace and space to practice tolerance as we hear one another's stories that are different than our own. So next slide, please. So first, I'd like to start off with here. I think our conscious intention has to be about acknowledging the social, economic, political, and the political constructs of the U.S. Our history is rooted in the Puritan, ethnic, individualistic culture. It's the dominant culture, the white culture. Race was created as a social construct to exploit and subjugate Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. People who were different were being subjugated. The US was built for white people, which means that it is ingrained in the foundation of it is in white supremacy. Captivity and genocide of the Native Americans speaks to that. September 17, 1787, the Constitution was penned by white men who were slave masters. And so we have a history in this country. Some people say 300, 400, 500 years of enslaving Black people or other people of color. In January 1863, Emancipation Proclamation was a strategic military decision, not a philosophical decision on people feeling bad about enslaving Black people. It was a military decision. The 13th Amendment freed slaves by law, not by race. And Black people, slaves at the time, and continue to be in the Constitution, not 3/5 of a person, but counted as 3/5 of a person in order to give the electoral vote more count. So people can be counted, Black people can be counted. And so the slave states could be equal to the non-slave states. And it was repealed through the 14th Amendment, but then it was grandfathered back in when we went to other practices. So next slide, please. So these are some of the social constructs of the United States. There's not all of them. There's not enough time to unpack all of this. I think it would take tons of time. So this is very surface. And in order for us to begin to understand what we are actually dealing with, and when we look at it, I think it's important for us to talk about, or at least for me to talk about and define what white privilege is. White privilege is a hidden and transparent preference that is often difficult to address. Only on closer inspection do we see how it creates a sense of entitlement, generates perks and advantages for white people, and elevates their status in the world. Our history books, our textbooks, our professional perceptions, law enforcement, diversity-related assumptions, Band-Aids, hygiene products, makeup, etc. That is all steeped in white privilege. And when you don't have to go to the drugstore and consciously think about, are they going to have makeup that matches my skin tone? Are they going to have stocking that match my skin tone? Am I going to see people who look like me in magazines or on TV or in ads or in the history books or the history that I understand? Then you have to think about, and that's privilege. The psychological rewards that one is given. Uh-oh, something just happened. Oh, right. The psychological rewards that one is given for being white most times are psychological burdens for people of color, Black, Native, and other indigenous people. It becomes their psychological burden. Next slide. In the US, privileges afforded to the following are afforded to the following dominant group: white people, males, middle-aged people, able-bodied people, heterosexuals, Christians, English-speaking people with no accent, cisgender individuals, middle, upper, or owning class people. These are the categories that we have created that avail privilege to people. And it crosses race sometimes, but not as often as it does if you are white. Next slide, please. So there are dual roles within social work, or at least how I see it. This is my lens, this is my perception, this is my personal experience as being a social worker. So I'm not here to challenge anyone about their perception, because perception is reality. So I'm not here to change anybody's reality. I am here to speak my truth. So how I see it, that social work was started in the 19th century in England. So there, the English are the colonizers. So it has to be steeped in social work. Our profession is steeped in colonial ideologies. In 1898, the first social work program was started at Columbia. And if you Google, you can find a chronological history of social work. That really doesn't. The reason why I didn't use it today, because it doesn't speak to Black people being in social work or other indigenous people. It speaks about white people being there. The purpose of social work is called to serve and to enhance the quality of life of all people. It embraces activism and social justice. It was concerned for inequality. It focused on disenfranchisement and marginalized people, but it was exclusive of BIPOC communities. And it's social justice driven. And it is exclusive. Back then, that was our history. The feminist presence of social work was not representative of Black, Latinx, Native American, and other indigenous women of color. So those women whose intent was to do well, this call to service, were white and privileged. For me, when hurting helps, when helping hurts, is when we look at, in 2019, the Bureau of Labor reports that 70% of all social workers are white. That's not representative of the communities that we serve or the students that are in our programs. There's inherent implicit bias at every level of practice and in each and one of us. It ignores and has ignored the impact of post-traumatic slave syndrome on enslaved people, how dehumanizing that was and continues to be, because we have modern enslavement. We have criminalized Black men. It embraces a color blindness and lacks a lens of cultural humility. Everything is fine, everything is good, and it is okay. And there's this preconceived notion that if you are a social worker of color, that you don't experience racism or microaggressions or discrimination. And that's not true, because it happens to us every day, all day. Because we don't get to walk around with our BSW or our MSW posted on our foreheads saying, I'm a professional social worker. So people don't know that when you go in the store or when you move in the world. We are hurting helpers when we're hesitant to embrace or act on racial justice. That's not in our history. We can be non-strengths based when we're always pathologizing behavior, or when we come in to the session or into the space or into the community as being the expert. It ignores the impact of intersectionality in the work, and we've been hesitant to integrate CRT. So much so, I believe, and even though we didn't know some of these concepts then, and we weren't looking at it, but in 1968, the National Association of Black Social Workers started because they needed to address, they saw, Dr. Shirley Better and others saw what they were seeing and what they were experiencing, and decided that this is so important that we need to separate ourselves to respond and address the unique issues for Black children, families, and community. That's how NABSW BSW started, was because of that. Next slide. This is Jane Addams. She's the mother of social work. We all, BSW program, MSW program, this is what we learn. This is who we see. This is the mother of social work. We know her. We can embrace her. I grew up in Chicago. I grew up going to Hull House. Participating in programs at Hull House. But we also know that Jane Addams modeled. Next slide, go ahead. Thank you. Jane Addams was born into wealth in Illinois. She was college educated. She was a humanitarian, a social activist, and a feminist. She traveled abroad, and she modeled Hull House after a settlement house in East London. She came back to the United States and she engaged young women of wealth, which we know were white, to volunteer their times, to fundraise, and some provided services and bring visibility to disenfranchised, marginalized people in Chicago, not Black people. This movement of recruiting these young women of wealth excluded Black, Indigenous, and other women of color. So this is why I speak to the history of social work being exclusive. When we look at Jane Addams and we talk about her and her work in working with disenfranchised and marginalized, I think we owe it to our students to say they were exclusive of Black, Indigenous, and other women of color. The communities that she was working with were immigrants from Europe. And so I think that we have to be honest about that and not leave that. That's why our intention has to be conscious, because otherwise we just say disenfranchised and marginalized communities. Next slide, please. We also know that Jane Addams, she was an activist. But she wasn't about racial justice. That wasn't her plight. And she befriended Ida B. Wells who was an African-American social activist on the South Side of Chicago, who just wasn't availed the privilege to earn a degree, because she probably would have been an MSW. She was also friends with Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. But in a local paper, a popular paper during that time, Jane Addams argued she was against mob violence because that's not humanitarian, but she was not against lynching. She suggested in this paper that the African-American who were being lynched, primarily men, were guilty and deserved to be lynched. Somewhere in there, they had to deserve this. But she was against the mob violence that came with lynchings. So this is her first connection to racial justice, but that's not her primary focus. And Ida B. Wells publicly wrote a rebuttal to this in her assumption that African Americans, but then, so now we see criminalization of Black men or Black people. Like, this needed to happen. If you're being lynched, hung by your neck, then you just somehow you must deserve that. But this is the mother of social work. And so therefore they challenged her on this. But they did not disconnect from her, because they marched with her and Susan B. Anthony and helped win women's right to vote. So they were part of the suffrage. In the back of the line, mind you, but they were there. But Black women did not have the right to vote until 5 decades later, until the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. I mean, in 65, I'm sorry, you're off. But they marched with her. So this is the mother of social work. And this is why it's important, I think, for us to know this part of the history, so that then we begin to educate this new generation of social workers in a way that is different from us, because this is the harmful piece when we don't know our history. In 1933, in his doctoral dissertation, Carter G. Woodson wrote The Miseducation of the Negro. In his book, he depicts how the Negro was being indoctrinated to assimilate to the dominant culture and not formally educated. He also challenges the oppressive systems of that time, as well as the status quo. And if we really take a look at it, that's the same thing that we're doing today. Our educational system continues to miseducate all of us. If you were educated K through 12, and I can even say undergrad, and even master's program, PhD programs, DSW, you are being miseducated because our books do not tell the truth. And we need to recognize that, and we need to seek truth ourselves. Next slide, please. And so this is how I see the complacency of social work. Again, me. This is the Native American movement. Where is social work? Where was social work? Where was social work when Native Americans were being or are being ignored, continue to be made invisible, marginalized, and criminalized as well, confined to reservations? Where is social work? Where are we screaming about? What are we doing for the Native American community? What are we doing as a profession, or maybe individually? Because I think it does trickle down to that. Next slide, please. Where's social work? Where was social work? When we talk about equality for women. For me as a Black woman, I can't focus on feminist movement until Black men are free. Till all Black people are liberated in this country. So feminist movements, feminist concerns, that's not going to be a primary concern, what I think, to Black women until Black people are free. When the NAACP was started, where was social work? Where was social work for the Japanese community in the internment camps? Where was social work? Can you go back to the next slide, please? To 15, yeah. Where was social work in World War II and Black soldiers came home and they faced just insurmountable amounts of discrimination when they had helped join the war? Even when they were told they didn't have the brain intelligence to be fighter pilots, but then it was yet the red tails that took out a lot of the enforcers' planes during that war. And then to come home and not have housing and have access to services that were made available to white veterans. Where was social work? Next slide, please. Where was social work? It was there, it showed up. 1964, Civil Rights Movement, because you know what was embedded in that? Equal pay for women, white women. Because in 1964, a lot of Black women were still domestics. We just wanted our freedom. We wanted to integrate our schools so our children could have better education. We weren't thinking about money. Where was social work in 1968 to get behind the 10-point plan of the Black Panthers, who were only asking for the things that we're asking for now? Where was social work? And where's social work right now today around Black Lives Matter? Where is social work? And I'm not saying white people aren't out there marching, but where is social work? Where's our banner? The National Association of Social Workers, we are behind Black Lives Matter, and this is what we're doing. When I look on the website, that's the first place that I went. When George Floyd was killed, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and social work, yes, we stand against it with just a statement. Where's the teeth? Where's the fight? These are rhetorical questions that I ask myself, but I go back to, I love social work, but I can't take on the fight by myself. I can do what I can do individually every single day in my work. But I have to ask these questions, because if I'm going to stay conscious, I have to ask these questions. Where is social work? Next slide, please. So I say that our responsibility right now, because we have this window, yet another window of opportunity, is to change the face of social work. Our purpose has to become more racially and socially justice focused. We can no longer afford to be silenced and complacent. If the underlying purpose of social work is to enhance the quality of life for all, then we got to get woke and understand that you can't speak social justice without equity and fairness. I believe that we have to radically rebuild the foundation of social work as we know it today. Even though this has been our beginning, it doesn't have to be our end. We get to change the history of our profession for the next 200 years. And we have to challenge ourselves to rid social work of any of the invasive and destructive viruses that continue to surface and break down the work that we are trying to do. And this means that we have to embrace a lens of cultural humility in our personal and professional lives. We have to educate ourselves as how to be an anti-racist, and how to be an anti-racist means you have to say loud and clear, I'm a racist, because somewhere in there, we got something. That's how we were socialized. We have to teach and practice from a lens of cultural humility, meaning that everything is not based on a dominant culture. Other people, BIPOC people move and see things and hear things in the world so different from white people. We have to get to that. We have to integrate the tenets of CRT into our social work curriculum. And I want to give a shout out to our colleagues at Cal State Dominguez, because they built their program on CRT, and that's the way they move. And so this is not just me. They have taught me a lot. And so I want to honor them because they are actually doing it. And integrate the importance of spirituality into our social work curriculum and practice, because that means a lot to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Spirituality is what has helped and supported our resilience as we've been dehumanized in the United States. Next slide, please. I only have 10 more minutes, so I'm going to try to jam through. And so I'm not going to give the definition. My understanding is the PowerPoint is going to go out. So if you can, and we definitely won't have time for exercise. We have to realize, wait, 1 second, this slide right here. We all have biases and prejudice, and our values show up in our action with people. If we think it doesn't, we're mistaken. Discussing biases, and we get that. This is why these conversations, like, you gotta have courage, because we've always known it's been risky. That's why social work has stayed away from these kind of conversations, because nobody wants to be mistaken for a racist, but we got to embrace that because we are. So scroll down, and that's the only way we're going to get past this. What we know, and these are just, America's a place where being Black is frequently a life sentence of cultural isolation and social invisibility. Yes, it is. Culturally, we see things and do things differently. That's why we're always in conflict, or there's tension when we're in the room, because we see things differently. But what most Black people have learned, and probably Latinx and other people of color, is we know how to code switch, because we were educated on the dominant culture. But the dominant culture wasn't educated on us, so the dominant culture doesn't know how to code switch with us. So when we say something, it's always like, why would they say that way or see it that way? It's because it's not based on the dominant culture. Whiteness will take from Black folks without reservation or apology. It will co-opt the Black struggle and bend it to suit a white-centered agenda many times. Many times. Stopping our racist patterns must be more important than working to convince others that we don't have it. We do have them, and people of color, we already know it. We can hear it, we see it, we hear it in your microaggressions. We know it's there. And our efforts, according to, and I applaud Robin DiAngelo, to prove otherwise is not convincing. Like, we don't have on Pepsi Cola glasses. We know exactly what's going on. We give you grace and we give you tolerance, because coming from enslaved people, we know humility really well. Sometimes to our disadvantage, we're so humble that it presents as passivity. But it's really is that we had to learn that. That was survival. So it's a well-developed skill for Black enslaved people. The purpose, and so we have to move. What cultural humility is going to do, is going to move us to intergroup dialogue. which I feel like we're having right now. Well, we're not dialoguing, but hopefully this will create some dialogue. So we have to integrate ourselves in conscious ways to start building bridges across. Next slide, please. This is important. This is the only way we can move forward in social work, because intergroup dialogue allows for the historical and the continuing group to speak to inequalities. We can look at demographic inequalities and demographic diversity, marginalization, exploitation, stigmatization of underprivileged groups by the systems of oppression. Next slide, please. I apologize that my phone never rings, my landline. And intergroup dialogue is facilitated face-to-face. And so truth can't come without relationship. And so this is why it's important for us to come together. And coming together in a way where the power bases are equalized. Next. And these are the benefits. It's a positive link between dialogue activity and intellectual and social self-confidence. People of color need to feel good about being in the room, being at the table and having a voice, being visible. It gets us to know what it is we're dealing with and have some social awareness, social identity, and affiliation and difference, as well as an increased knowledge about other groups and social inequality. And it's increased communication. This has to be practiced. This is not anything that comes easy because we have never learned how to do this. And so now we have to learn. Next slide, please. And it gets us from being, which we mean when we talk about increased comfort in dealing with diversity, reduction in intergroup anxiety, reducing in stereotyping, increased tolerance, increased motivation for building bridges, and into doing, from being and doing, like yin and yang. We have an interest in taking action toward equity and justice. That's the only way you could talk about social justice. That's the only way that social work, that has to be the undergird of social work, is equity and justice. Next slide, please. And the lesson for all of us, I think, is that all people have a special song to sing. That's our stories. That's our stories. That's our narrative. That's our experience. And these songs come in various genres and rhythms. Your song is your purpose or your identity. And when you don't have a purpose or identity, you're just walking around in the world blind. And this is what happened to Native American kids when they were yanked, enslaved, and taken into boarding schools. They lost their purpose and their identity. They lost their souls. And a people's song constitutes all the realities that those people are that of those people's cultures. And culture is that you know what you know, like we know what we know. And you don't have to explain it. You just know. A colleague and I we were doing a training together on cultural humility. And it was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And so we walked in the room and the organization was going to have a potluck after our presentation. And my colleague is Black, Dr. Alan Lipstone, some of you may know him. And we walked past the mac and cheese and the dressing, and we looked at it and we both like, because we knew it didn't look like the mac and cheese or the dressing that we were used to. So we actually passed on the potluck. So I use that in a humorous sense because it has you have to have some humor in this. But we know what we know. We know what mac and cheese looks like. We know what dressing looks like. And we both were saying without saying, some white people made that mac and cheese and some white people made that dressing. So we know it might be good, but it's not going to be what we know and what our tongue palates need. These are the kind of things. This is what culture means. It is real. It's happening. And it's the answer to the question, like, why are we here? And that's what, because we're all heading the same way. But you need to know if you're going to live a life well lived and deserving and leave a legacy for your next generation, then you got to know why you're here and what your purpose is. And I'll leave this. My policy professor at Cal State Long Beach, Dr. John Oliver, gave this to me. It didn't, I put the picture in it, but he gave me this. Mental health practitioners who lack the skills, attitude, and knowledge to work effectively in cross-cultural settings are incompetent, and schools that continue to graduate mental health professionals who are unprepared for such practice are irresponsible. Let's not continue to make social work irresponsible. We have to do this work. As painful as it may be, we need to look at self, because the truth of the matter is social work is sprinkled with people from all walks of life, because it is here in this profession that we seek some type of healing. However, we can't begin to support the healing of others until we heal ourselves. And so when we are unwilling to acknowledge the flaws in psychotherapy, psychoanalytic, and dominant cultural medical models, and understand and know that these interventions can cause harm when not practiced from a person and environment or a lens of cultural humility or with the undercurrent of CRT, then social work will continue to cause harm. It's only when we begin to integrate these thoughts at a level of consciousness and begin to practice them can social work be a friend and a healer to the many marginalized and disenfranchised groups who have continued to experience some form of historical trauma on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jolene. We have had a number of questions that came in, and we don't have time for all of them, but we'll ask one question. So if Laura could go ahead and ask you one.
What does it mean that the 13th Amendment freed slaves by law, not by race?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Sure. What does it mean that the 13th Amendment freed slaves by law, not by race?
Right. So what it means, how you interpret it, okay, and so you got to think, you got to be conscious about your interpretation or your definition of it. It means that a law had to be passed to say that slaves were free. A law is being passed. There's not a law that says white people are free. So the law had to be written to say slavery is against the law. It is not because Black people have rights as white people. Why do we have to even have a law, an amendment in the Constitution that says that? So slaves were free. Black people were freed by law, and they can change the law, which means we're back into slavery. And not that we're quite out of it yet anyway, but it's just the stroke of the pen. That is not the white experience. The Constitution was written for white people, not Black people. It is a set of laws, policy, if you want to say. And you can also watch Slavery by Another Name. Slavery by Another Name is also, I tend to like that one a little bit better because it gives you more of a historical perspective. And yes, white men were landowners. So that's what it means. We are free by law, not by race. It doesn't say, oh, because people of different color. It wouldn't even say that. It It just say all people are free. That's what I mean.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer and an amazing presentation. And I'm so grateful that you were here to share that with all of us here. I do want to let the audience know that we are recording this. I put in some things in the chat that were confusing because different people were throwing things in. So the final word is we can share the recording. We will share the PowerPoint slides, and we will share a list of resources and an additional handout or two that we think go along with what we're talking about today. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to move on to our featured speaker. In fact, she was one of our very first presenters when we did our law and ethics training at least 15 years ago. And she told me it was one of her first speaking engagements, and it helped her to build confidence in her message. And I'm really, really glad because her message is powerful. We're pleased to have her back to help us bring a perspective to our modern system of social welfare institutions with a macro analysis. Please welcome Natalia Salinas.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. You know, I didn't even know that that was one of your first law and ethics meetings. But so first, I'd like to thank you for inviting me again, the Women's Council, to speak. And those that know me know that I'm very direct and to the point. And I don't do that because I want to cause some sort of reaction, but rather I simply think like the skill and perhaps the motivation for fluffing things up. So another thing that I'd like to clear up, kind of like what Jolene said, is I'm not here to try to convince anyone of anything. So if you have strongly held beliefs one way or another, that is fine. My talk is probably not going to make a big difference, maybe for anyone. So I have 25 minutes and it will be my truth and my beliefs and a small piece of who I am. So slide number 2. I don't know why I can't see the slides. Hold on. So I'm assuming that the slide is being shown. No? So maybe it's getting set up. There it goes. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so actually I was going to look at this slide. Okay, so capitalism, a profit-driven system, and the values of social work. Is it possible to eradicate structural racism within a system that profits from racism? How have our roles been co-opted and used in ways that contribute to structural racism and oppression? Next slide. So many of you know that I worked for Kaiser for about 8 years. And when I started, we were in the midst of a stagnant contract negotiations. And when I left, it was basically the same thing, a repeat of when I started. I became quickly involved, as I usually do, and became a shop steward, as I usually do. While Kaiser had added 422,000 new paying members nationwide and made record profits during the first 9 months of 2014, staffing levels, which were already too low, fell further behind, withholding mental health services while increasing membership numbers. Membership numbers is an effective way to score rocket profits, but it led to woefully inadequate care. So is this a problem of Kaiser or a problem of capitalism? Some workers compare Kaiser's CEO pay to Blue Cross CEO pay and say, well, at least the discrepancy is less at Kaiser. This comparison to the lowest denominator is what capitalists would prefer as they race to the top by driving us to the bottom. Capitalism works by selling something people want or need and they sell it at market value. And to make a profit, they must produce what people need or want for cheaper than they sell it. So in other words, the fewer mental health clinicians they have and the fewer they pay us, the more money in their pockets. They pay us only a small fraction of what we produce, and then they work hard to divide us and keep us divided so that they can pay us even less and break us maybe at the next contract. This is the nature of their game. Next slide. The more we allow ourselves to be divided, the less unity and strength we have to fight back. Racism is the nature of capitalism, not human nature. Identity politics is just more of the same. It focuses on our differences rather than identifying that we all have the same battle and actually have more in common than different. Before I move on, just to define a couple of these heavy loaded words, ruling class. When I say ruling class, I'm referring to the top 5% that owns most wealth in the United States. And when I say working class, I'm also including working class allies like social workers. Next slide. Here is a comparison of the Black-white income gap. The gap has held steadily, well, pretty steady since 1970. Even in the small dips and small hills in that, you could clearly see that they're interrelated. The more Black people can be exploited, the more white people can be exploited. And any gains made by one group are also experienced by the other. Structural racism is necessary to control us all. And whether we achieve 10 or 1,000 more reforms, this won't change the nature of capitalism and its reliance on racism. Next slide. Here is a quote that I really like by Martin Luther King because it kind of points to what I just said. So America is deeply racist and its democracy is flawed, both economically and socially. The Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all its own interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of our society. It reveals systemic racism, systemic rather than superficial flaws, and suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced. Next slide. The Kaiser Permanente model of care requires prepaid benefits and spends that money to later provide services. However, if no services are rendered or very little services rendered, that is more money in Kaiser's pocket. An illustration of this, Kaiser averages 600 hospital days per year in a post-acute care facility for every 1,000 clients. By comparison, on average, Medicare pays for about 2,000 hospital days per year in a post-acute care facility for every 1,000 clients. So clearly, these are very different numbers. Under the Kaiser model, patients with serious psychiatric needs, like the ones that I was working with, their needs go untreated and have to wait for more than 7 weeks for an appointment because providers under the Kaiser model are forced to do as much as possible with as little staff as possible. I'm sorry. And under the fee-for-service model, providers and hospitals make bigger profits by having you be sick. If you overeat, you smoke, misuse medicine, and require hospital beds, enrollments in high nursing facilities, drug treatment, and use of other expensive interventions such as dialysis, that is more money in their pocket. That fee-for-service model reminds me a little bit of how the opiate crisis started in the overprescribing of opiates without much care for what it was doing to people. So sure, there are pros and cons to both models, but both are based on profit. And therefore, their bottom line is that they remain competitive in the market of capitalism and continue to function under capitalism, they must provide services in a way that keeps bringing them profits. Back to our original question. Next slide. Is it possible to eradicate structural racism within a system that profits from racism? Although from time to time, we are given the opportunity to negotiate and vote on contracts, our unity and our ability to withhold our labor power is all we really have. But we never really win, because either way, we continue divided by racism and as wage slaves. We don't work, we don't have money. We don't have money, we don't eat. Are you having trouble with which one I'm on? Okay. So to believe racism, discrimination, oppression, etc., can be eliminated by working within capitalism is to not understand how essential these things are to capitalism. Next slide. Capitalism stands on 3 pillars. The first one is the money and banks. The second one is commodity production, or in other words, production for sale at a market. And the third one is the wage system. The wage system is the pillar upon which racism rests. We as a group of united social workers can have our code of ethics and values, but capitalism will continue to run according to its design, regardless of our code of ethics, our values, our wishes, our morals, our fancies, terminology, our fancy handouts. Slide 10. Next slide. Capitalism by design was not created for the majority. We can see this even today during the pandemic. The rich continue to get richer and the poor continue to get poorer. And this is not by coincidence, but again, by design. Here's an illustration of how the richest families are the only group who have gained wealth since the Great Recession of the 1980s. The recession affected the top 5%, but who ended up paying to correct this error in their system? We did, through our taxes. By 2016, we see wealth dropping for all except that highest top 5%. I'm sure most have also heard that currently under COVID-19, that top 5% has continued to make huge profits. Next slide. I really like this poster. So, feeling sad and depressed? Are you anxious, worried about the future, feeling isolated and alone? You might be suffering from capitalism. And some of those symptoms may include homelessness, unemployment, poverty, hunger, feelings of powerlessness, fear, apathy, boredom, cultural decay, loss of identity, extreme self-consciousness, loss of free speech, incarceration, suicidal, or death. All right, we can move on. Our field of social work has started as a fight for something better, different, more fair. And we were working class allies. And although we can still be working class allies, our field of social work was co-opted and molded to fit within capitalism. We primarily put band-aids on problems and end up being bogged down with reform struggles. I know I often have to ask myself, am I doing more to maintain the system of racist oppression? Am I merely an agent of social control? Or am I working to address the root cause of the problem? Next slide. And here's another quote that I like from Martin Luther King, kind of, again, accentuating what I just said. So now, when we see that there must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power, then we see that for the last 12 years, we have been in a reform movement. We were seeking to reform certain conditions in the house of our nation because the nation wasn't living up to the very rules the house that it had prescribed in the Constitution. Then, after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. I think we must see the great distinction between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement. Now, these are not the kind of quotes that you read about in your school books, because what is quoted here and in other speeches that he gave um, are the reasons that he eventually was killed. But the earlier speeches, it was before he had traveled the world and come to some bigger conclusions as to how things were running and ran. So pretty much about 1 year prior to his death, he had come out against the Vietnam War. And he was killed because after much traveling, again, he started to realize that root problem and most importantly, started to ask why. Next slide. Theory and practice must be linked together. We must put to practice what we learn and take to the streets with actions. We must be open to learning from our clients and from our struggles to achieve something better from them. Learning about injustices threatens no one. You can read and study as much as you want and change nothing by it. Your thoughts and beliefs are not actions. Reading 10 books, reading 20 books is not action. Learning about structural racism is nothing if you don't do something with it, or if you don't create the space and opportunity to do something. So kind of like what Jolene had been saying earlier, where is social work? But also what will we be doing? And what we're going to be doing, what we do is even more important. Let's see. Oh, shoot. That's right. I'm going to read another Martin Luther King Jr. Thing, but this one was too long to put in a slide. So let's see, page 250. Sorry, I should have marked. Okay. So I want to say to you, as I move to my conclusion, as we walk about, where do we go from here? That we honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the questions of reconstructing the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here. And one day we must ask the question, why? Why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalist economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are all called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs reconstructing. It means that questions must be raised. You see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the questions. Who owns the oil? You begin to ask the questions, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? These are questions that we must be asked. That's definitely my favorite. So in getting back to the beginnings of our profession and addressing the root problem, we are capable of transforming the world around us. We can and will create something better. Social workers would no longer be gatekeepers to services or used for social control. We would provide needed services as community members. We would all share the responsibility of ensuring our communities work and that our world worked better. We would not work for individual gain or individual companies or for our country to be number one, but rather for us to live as one. From time to time, I become discouraged and the larger long-term goals just seem huge and daunting. Slide 14. Theory and practice must be linked together. We must put to practice what we learn, and it takes sorry, I just wrong cut and paste. Okay, here I am. Maybe. So sorry. Okay, so when I get discouraged, I remember a quote that my friend Gene Rothman used to cite for me. And it went, you move a mountain one scoop of dirt at a time. And then he gave me this really fancy spoon. And I think of that, and then sometimes, you know, as I'm digging and as I'm scooping out, I find gems. And so for me, those wonderful quotes by Martin Luther King Jr. are gems for me. And another one is a study that I came across about 2 years ago. It's a pretty old study from like 2008, but I love it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. So it was a discovery by Dr. Spalowski. I'm sorry, my English is not as good as my Spanish. Who studied baboons for over 30 years. In his study of baboon troops, he noted that males were very aggressive and society was highly stratified. Females took abuse and were highly stressed. Then something horrific but scientifically interesting happened to one of the baboon troops. The Kikorok troop took to foraging for food in the garbage dump of a popular tourist lodge. The trash included meat tainted with tuberculosis. The result was that nearly half of the males in the troop died. But even more specific, every alpha male was gone, and there were twice as many females as males left. And the males who remained were what we would call the good guys. They were not aggressive or abusive. They were nice to the females. They were socially affiliative. And this completely transformed the atmosphere in the troop. When male baboons reach adolescence, they typically leave their home troop and roam, eventually finding a new troop. And when new adolescent males would join this troop, they'd come in just as aggressive as any adolescent baboon males elsewhere on the planet. And it would take them about 6 months to learn. Hey, we're not like that in this troop. We don't do stuff like that. We're not as aggressive. We spend more time grooming and taking care of each other. Males are calmer and with each other and with the females. We do not dump on anyone just because we're in a bad mood. Again, I emphasize, it took them only 6 months to assimilate to this style of baboon culture and continued to do that 20 years later. The fundamental lesson that I get from this is that while constant high stress negatively affects us, the absence of stress also impacts us. This troop no longer had the same problems as other troops with high blood pressure or problems with brain chemistry related to anxiety and high stress hormone levels. And what were the key ingredients that reduced the stress and promoted longevity? The answers seem to be compassion, connection to others, and caring for others. And these are not things that I'm making up on my own. I'm telling you about this study. So again, the answers seem to be compassion, connecting to others, and caring for others. Social connection is a remarkably powerful thing. And one of the greatest forms of connection is giving rather than receiving. The Kikorok troop did not only survive without stress, they thrived. The conditions in which people live and work are absolutely vital for health. One of the most interesting things the Kikorok troop taught us is that if they are able to transform in one generation, what are supposed to be textbook social systems and ingrained character defects, then baboons appear to be more evolved than humans. So how can we create a society that will allow humans to flourish? A society where rather than valuing selfishness, sharing is valued. A society rather than valuing individualism, collectivity is valued. A society no longer based on the profit motive, but based on our love and connection to all. So I'll give you a hint as to how to create this, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel. This kind of society is called communism. And I understand that there is a lot of anti-communism out there. And of course there would be. because we live under capitalism, and capitalists, that's what they do, is they don't want to be removed, they don't want to be overthrown, and so they will continue to promote and foment anti-communist ideas. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone about communism and what that is. You could, send me a personal message if you'd like. But this is one of my favorite topics, and I really believe that at some point we will live like the Kikorok troop and nourish each other. We'll work according to our ability. Again, our love and commitment for each other will produce abundance, and we'll share it all without letting a few people hoard it or even destroy the abundance because it can't be sold at market for whatever they're wanting, or to keep prices up. And eventually we can live as one, united and connected to all. And I don't know how long I took, but I'm pretty much done if anybody has questions.
We're actually out of time for questions, unfortunately, as usual, and I apologize, but we, again, will pull the questions and respond back after with the document. Thank you so much, Natalia. That vision was just so uplifting, and your analysis of what we're dealing with was so clear. I'm just really grateful for your ability to share that with us. We have, as you can see, tried to pack a lot of information into a short time. So what we decided to do, since we don't really have time to address everything, is to have two members of our Women's Council who have agreed to respond to these presentations. So I'm very honored to present Carrie Manier and Renee Wyatt. They are both passionate and talented social workers, and they're going to share their thoughts and feelings about the material we heard and how it affected them on behalf of our audience. So Carrie, would you like to start?
Hey everyone, my name is Carrie Mounier. I want to thank Jolene Swain and Natalia Salinas for their presentations, for the perspectives they shared, and for raising so many questions for me. Many of the things shared by our presenters are new to me. My initial response was, why haven't I heard this before? Why didn't I know that when social work was originally formulated, that it was a call to help and serve disenfranchised and marginalized people who were not Black, Indigenous, or other people of color? Was I not paying attention in school? Is this a blind spot for me? My guess is that the reason I didn't remember these things is because of my own white privilege. That if I did hear it, it didn't reflect my personal experience. So it wasn't salient to me and I didn't remember it. So it's a reminder to me that even after many years of practicing, being conscientious, and believing myself to be self-aware, I can be limited by the scope of my own experiences. In hindsight, it resonates with me to learn that social work at the national level has been reluctant to embrace critical race theory. It fits with our national narrative. Has anyone read the president's executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping, issued by President Trump on September 22nd, 2020? That anyone who receives federal funds isn't supposed to talk about critical race theory anymore. We aren't supposed to teach anything about American history that says the United States has been anything but a noble leader seeking freedom and justice for all. And this is consistent with how I remember history being taught. Colorblind, whitewashed in a way that makes founders always look heroic and triumphant. And it matches my experience learning social work history, that it was at least selectively colorblind. Even though it's evident that implicit bias impacts many aspects of social work, I don't think I grasped it during my socialization to the profession. Be cautious. You are at risk of being entrapped in a system that is contributing to historical injustice. What I remember learning is, rah, rah, social workers are champions of social justice. I really liked hearing about the relationship between Jane Addams and Ida B. Wells. Because of her white privilege and white ways of knowing, Jane Addams initially held the view that African American victims of lynching might be guilty of the crimes of which they were accused, and so the lynching might be justified. Ida B. Wells disagreed with Jane Addams' assumptions, recognizing that these assumptions were based on and reinforced the stereotype of African American inferiority. Wells was able to articulate that the purpose of the lynch mob was to dehumanize African Americans and strip them of any sense of having civil rights, that the alleged crimes were only excuses for violence. What I liked hearing was that there was bravery, which led to dialogue, and there was an openness to the dialogue. And through that exchange, Jane Addams' perspective was changed. And then Jane Addams and Ida B. Wells could ally with each other and work together on combating the injustice of lynching. This was a transforming experience. In very small ways, I've had this experience in my friendships and collaborations with bicultural colleagues. I work with youth, and one time we were planning a field trip to take youth to see the play Wicked. And Wicked is the backstory about the Wicked Witch in Wizard of Oz. And I was so surprised that many of the youth had never seen the movie Wizard of Oz. I was like, how can they not have seen Wizard of Oz? Wizard of Oz is like Bambi. Everyone sees it when they are kids. And my bicultural friend and colleague who immigrated from El Salvador as a child told me, I have never seen either of those movies. And that was stunning to me. I know this is small, but it made me realize how limited my own worldview and experiences are. This was something I needed to understand in order to connect better with the young people we were serving. But on my own, I was making incorrect assumptions about them and what I thought they should know or should have experienced. My conclusion from this experience is that although white women, including myself, may represent 70% of the profession, we need to take up less than 70% of the space. We need to be more open, welcoming, engaged, and willing to be transformed by our relationships with our Black, Indigenous, and people of color colleagues, which means sometimes, a lot of the times, we need to be learners and not leaders. I've been learning more over the last several months that there are times when I may not be able to take the lead with creating change, but that even when I can't take the lead, I can still contribute to change. I can use my privilege and lend it to the cause of racial and social justice. And because I am privileged, it can help. It can amplify the message. It can add credibility to the message among other white people and lend some support and protection to the people braving the path. But I'm also understanding I can't always be a follower. There are times in my experience when I know that things are wrong, when I know that there's an absence of diversity, when I can see that voices aren't being heard or that certain client populations are being inadequately served, or that microaggressions are flying and that mistreatment is being justified. And at those times, I've learned to be braver, to speak up, even if the response is silence, even if no one validates my point of view. I've learned to take the long view, that even if no one acknowledges what I'm saying in the moment, it doesn't mean that I'm wrong. Often it means I need to build bridges and create coalitions, because there usually are people in the room who also see the problems, but everyone is fearful about speaking up alone. I want to say a little bit more about compliance. Social workers are big on compliance. We teach social work students to be compliant. We teach them to think about the system and the rules before we teach them to think about people. We teach that being compliant is more important than doing no harm. This is a little bit like Jane Addams' assumptions, which were based on stereotypes about inferiority, and that reinforced assumptions about inferiority. I assume you are inferior, so you need to be compliant. And my emphasis on the importance of your compliance reinforces my assumptions of your inferiority. I'm not completely against compliance. There are times when compliance seems to have some value and offers some needed care and protection. But other times, many other times, focusing on compliance is just controlling, devaluing, or dehumanizing people. For example, I work with young people experiencing homelessness, and the message they receive everywhere is, you can't be here. There isn't any place you are allowed to be, but you can't be here. Be compliant. From my point of view, compliance has no value in a situation like this. We need to rethink our allegiance to compliance. When compliance does not add value, there are ways to challenge the notions of compliance. There are counter arguments and approaches that can be effective and change people's trajectories. These are not easy tasks. These are not things that many social work students will figure out how to do on their own. But we can teach them if we see that there's value in teaching them to be critical of the idea of compliance for the sake of compliance. And we can teach them and mentor them in using the counter arguments to change trajectories. I've also been thinking more about Natalia's question. How can a system that profits from racism possibly become free of structural racism? How can reform efforts really be anything meaningful if it relies on racism to profit and profiting is the ultimate goal? In capitalism, prioritizing profit drives inadequate services, inadequate education, and inadequate support to people who are poor, which keeps some people poor and creates health disparities and keeps their labor cheaper. But some Americans are raised to embrace capitalism as necessary for democracy and individual freedom, even though we know that freedom as written was not really intended for all of us. Talking about alternatives to capitalism or evils of capitalism makes a lot of people afraid, even as we see the truth in the principles that capitalism requires oppression. I think capitalism equals freedom for people with money and power and influence. But for people without money and power and influence, capitalism equals oppression. Because it's structural oppression and not interpersonal oppression, it keeps some people down so they can't move from one place to another. So for slave owners, capitalism felt like freedom. And for people who were enslaved, capitalism meant that they were imprisoned. This feels wrong, but I don't have an answer for this. But we are in a moment in history where change is happening. This window of change won't be open forever. And what we do makes a difference. And even if we are scared, because we are also embedded in the capitalist system, we can decide where we stand, what our priorities are, who we want to support, and how we can contribute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was very inspiring. Now to bring it home, I'd like to bring on Renee Wyatt as the other part of our response panel. Renee?
Oh my goodness. Let's give our speakers another thumbs up. Another thumbs up. And thank you, Carrie, also. That was so inspiring. Again, our speakers were amazing and their views are just so awesome. I feel they were both transparent on two different levels. Natalia spoke eloquently about the profit-driven system of capitalism. And I really like that slide about feeling sad and depressed. You must be suffering from capitalism. Makes a lot of sense. And Jolene spoke exquisitely about white privilege. Can you imagine the founder of social work, Jane Addams, thought Blacks deserved to be lynched? Well, just until she met Ida B. Wells. I must say, ladies, you have given us something to think about. Thank you for ruffling my feathers. So now you know why we're here today. Oh yes, to start dialogue about structural racism within our profession. It saddens me to face this truth. As a matter of fact, it's heart-wrenching. I don't like it at all. Although I've known all my life that I had to work harder than my white friends to get ahead, because my mother truly reminded me all the time, you have 3 strikes against you, Renee. You're Black, you're a woman, and you're poor. Okay. Nevertheless, I was fortunate to get a degree from California State University, Dominguez Hills, with a focus on, guess what? Critical race theory. Ooh, the truth slapped me upside the head. Systems are created to oppress people of color. I was furious. I was ready to start my own right. Now, here I am working for that same system. Wow. Anyway, I believe I was destined to be a therapist through lived experience. Plus, I love my work and I plan on becoming a licensed clinical social worker. Racial trauma affects all of us. The power elite, white men, employed their own people to carry out their dirty deeds through well-built structures like HUD, county aid programs, the prison industry, children's court, and of course, the social work profession and other businesses or corporations. So now the question is, what are we going to do? Better yet, what are you going to do? I believe this is an opportunity to examine our individual views about structural racism and the need for change. Myself, I'm looking forward to the path of transformation. I want to join hands with my colleagues to talk about the hurt and the pain of the trauma we've suffered. Then and only then can we move forward into the solution. For instance, my solution is incorporating trauma-informed care into our profession. I remember the first training I attended. The idea introduced was, what happened to you instead of what did you do? That idea changed my position as a social worker. I was rocketed into the 4th dimension. I became more sensitive to my position and the client's needs. Plus, the 6 guiding principles assisted me to offer my best self to people I work with, including colleagues, coworkers, and clients. Let me share the principles with you. Safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. These principles could be the foundation we need to address the structural racism lens that allows us to see, as a society, we are more or less take for granted a context of white leadership, dominance, and privilege, justifying racial inequality such as white people take a stand and Black people stand back. So here we are. If you're anything like me, you may be angry. But the good thing is we're in position to do something about this annoying situation. I'm just not sure what I can do yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. That was so heartfelt. And I loved the way you tied in the racial trauma and the picture of what are ways that we can move forward. So for all of you who've joined us today, I hope you felt challenged, intrigued, inspired, and maybe even a little overwhelmed by what you heard. I can see in the chat and the questions that it's really raised a lot of thoughts. So I would just ask you to consider creating an intention for what you will do with your experience today. How does this move forward for you? I also want to just identify a few final announcements. You will receive the link in the chat, I think. Will be put in the chat so that everyone has the link to the final evaluation. Especially, we would like to see if everyone who's here would complete the evaluation. Those who are getting CEUs, there's a post-test. I see it went in there. So take a look at that, complete that for us. Those of you who are getting CEUs will pull that, and then we'll prepare your certificates and email them back to you. And again, try to complete that by the end of the day today. And just know that we are going to email you with presentations, handouts, and the recording of this seminar. It was so good, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, that I really would hope that you would relook at it, share it with colleagues, and use it as a teaching tool to help us to move forward. We did want to start by supporting the Breathe Act. That's one of the areas that we identified, and so we'll be sending you some information about that, as well as a list of references from our presenters and a bunch of different both social work and racial justice links to videos and talks and other things we found in our journey of looking to see what was out there. And we want to share that with you in case you would like to be able to learn more from that and be able to work forward with that. So again, take a little time right now and move into that evaluation link and complete that. You can complete that before you leave. And again, I want to thank Cheryl Branch for her superwoman status and for her masterful management of the seminar. As this was our first time, we got our messages mixed a little bit, but again, we really thank you for taking the time. And I just want to see if either of our presenters or any of our presenters has any final comment they'd like to share with the audience before we leave. We have like 2 minutes for that.
I've been seeing some of the comments and questions, and I love the conversation. There was a question about contact information. I don't know how to share that, but I'm sure it'll be figured out.
Okay, yes, we'll make sure that you have the contact information for our featured and keynote speakers, absolutely.
I just want to thank Brenda, you and your committee for just having the courage to put this on. Unless we start the dialogue, it won't be any dialogue. This is going to be a process, and a process of learning for all of us. And so we have to give ourselves the grace and the space and the patience to move through this. So, so I just want to acknowledge you all and for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. So I think from here, we're going to give you just a few more minutes so that you can complete that, that link and make sure you've done your evaluation, especially those that registered for CEUs. And if by chance you have not put your name for CEUs in the chat earlier, Cheryl did ask that you do that again so that we can double check and make sure that we had you here. So if there's anyone that didn't see that and didn't do that, we had mixed messages about how we were going to verify that everyone that signed up for CEUs actually attended the session. And so just to be sure, if you could put your name in there, then that will help make sure that we've got it all confirmed and we're able to give you that credit. So give us a little time to get those out to you, but that should happen really soon. So, and here's our wonderful acknowledgements page. Wanted to also acknowledge the Social Action Social Justice Council and just be really grateful that we had this opportunity with everyone. So I think we're going to end here. Please put your information in. Please fill out the registration, the evaluation form and the post-test if you're receiving the CEUs. And we thank you so much for taking the time to join this conversation with us. We hope that this will be the first of many more kinds of opportunities to further this kind of discussion and continue to work in this area. So thank you all. So we're going to leave the room open so everyone who wants still has a chance to access that link, complete it, put your information in, and we'll leave it open for maybe 10 minutes after, an additional 10 minutes just to be sure. But again, I want to totally express our gratitude to Jolene, Natalia, Carrie, and Renee for the heartfelt and beautiful comments and information that they shared. So again, thank you to all our panelists. If you would like to share anything with the council members who are here on the panel. whatever that's called, room. If you have any questions, please speak up at this point. It looks like people are leaving, and we've captured all of the chat as well as the questions and answers. And so we'll look through those and maybe look to, if it makes sense, to share some additional information in response to that or not, because we may have, with the references we send and the additional resources, there may be enough information that we don't really need to do anything else with the questions.
When do you think the CEUs will be coming to people? Good sign.
That's going to depend, I think, on Laura. Laura is going to be capture, like transferring. So she'll get the list from Cheryl to verify who was there. And then I think she has the capacity to produce the certificates. So I just need to go back with her and make sure we have an updated certificate to use. So it shouldn't really take too long. I'm thinking maybe sometime by the end of this week. But I better.
It only takes like 5 seconds to do it. So as long as I have the list, I can send them out before the end of the week for sure.
Okay.
I'm taking off. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, Carrie. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Who was that?
Hi, Hillary. That was
Hi.
Hillary.
Thank you for being helping be the timekeeper. I so appreciate that. I realized that there was no way I could do that. And I'm glad, because I was texting behind the scenes about all these different questions and trying to follow up on stuff. So I couldn't follow the time at all.
Actually, Ely really gets the credit for that. I think she signed up already.
Thank you, Eileen, if you're still on. Okay, so we have a small group at this point. And Natalia, I just have to say, I loved your presentation. I thought it was just outstanding. So I just wanted to thank you.
I did too. Boy, Natalia, you are definitely on point. Yeah, you didn't pull no punches. You went straight for the head or something. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And Barbara and Marilyn helped me some too. So thank you guys.